Okay. All right. This is where we imagine walking into the room together. Or I guess we'd already be in the room. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming to the virtual Ivy Bookshop with Fran Wilde and Theodora Goss tonight. We're just going to give it a couple minutes for people to arrive, and then we'll get started. I feel like I should have this.
You should, absolutely.
Hanging from my ceiling.
Aww.
If you're looking for this book, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Ivy.
Oh my goodness, I see David Bodo in the audience. Hi, David. Hi, Nancy. I'm just peeping at the audience now because. Hi, Chris and Rhiannon and Bethan. Thank you guys for coming. All right, I'm not going to be able to do that for very long, but I'm just excited. This is like old home week. Just being like, the bookstores that I've been to so far is the first bookstore that I ever bought, an independent bookstore that I ever bought my own book at back when I was a kid. Aww. And then the Ivy, of course. So
that's so special. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and people might continue to trickle in while I'm talking, but that's okay. I'm not the main event, but I do want to welcome all of you who are here tonight from the Ivy Bookshop in Baltimore, Maryland. We're delighted to have you, and we're delighted to be hosting Fran Wilde, who we owe many congratulations to for this week's publication of Clockstar Rosespine, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous book. And I was thinking actually, my first ever book selling job was at Avid Bookshop in Athens, Georgia, and Updraft had just come out, and I was like, who's this Fran Wilde person? Like, this is an amazing book. And then I moved here and started to work at the Ivy and realized that Fran was a longtime friend of the Ivy, and it blew my mind. So it's a dream to be hosting this event tonight. And I want to introduce Fran and her work more broadly by saying that she is the Double Nebula Award-winning author of 7 novels for children and adults, including The Ship of Stolen Words. Look at this gorgeous book, which came out in June of this year. So she has 2 books out this year, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And she's also written numerous short stories, reviews, and essays that cross literary and genre boundaries. She's also trained as an artist, jeweler, programmer, and poet. And she received her MFA in poetry from Warren Wilson College and an MA in interaction design from the University of Baltimore. So basically, she's very cool. And she's the genre fiction concentration director at Western Colorado University. This is her first collection of poetry and illustration. But I do want to say that sorry, I'm going to take the liberty. There's a line in here that I feel like describes this collection and also Fran's work more broadly. It's actually, the line is in response to a Louise Bourgeois exhibit. But the line is, we are pieces and the sum of our pieces, containers and contained, always rebelling against restrictions of wall and page. And when I read that, I was like, that's Fran's work, and especially this book. So we're delighted to be celebrating it tonight. And Fran is in conversation with another author of brilliance and breadth, Theodora Goss, whose 2020 book, Medusa's Daughters, which is also so just beautiful inside and out, came out from Lanternfish Press, which is the same press that published Clockstar Rosespine in 2020. And she's the World Fantasy Award-winning author of many publications across genres, including short stories, poetry, a novella, and several novels, including, which I'm sure you've heard of, including The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter, European Travel for the Monstrous Gentlewoman, and The Sinister Mystery of the Mesmerizing Girl. She has been a finalist for many awards, including the Nebula, and she teaches literature and writing at Boston University and in the Stone Coast MFA program. So this is going to be a wonderful exchange tonight between the two of them. I will put links to purchase the books in the chat as soon as I turn off my camera here. And I do also want to say that all copies of Clockstar Rosespine from the Ivy come with this gorgeous swag pack, which has many beautiful things inside.
There's a typewriter in it. I love the typewriter.
It has a typewriter in it, in here. So if you haven't held this book yet, I highly suggest that you do. It is an experience to hold and read. And I hope you all enjoy the evening. So thank you, Fran.
Could you show some of the illustrated pages, or
yeah, Dora's not seen them because they're waiting for you in Boston.
Well, I saw them. I saw them for the first time yesterday because I got a manuscript of this, but it was just the early manuscript, and I just saw them as PDFs. Yeah, they're so gorgeous.
This is the one that I posted on my Instagram, but it's the Fact of the Cage, and the typewriter is I'm so glad. Yeah. Oh, the map. Yeah,
I love them. This is my favorite. A map is a resume. Yeah.
I was on a map drawing kick for a little while, which
and I have questions for you, Fran, which we'll get to, about how the illustrations interact with the poems.
Okay.
And how all of this came to be, because it's not exactly usual, right, to have something this intricate for a book of poetry, but let's get to that. So our plan was that you were actually going to read first, and you had this crazy idea that you wanted like a poem off. So you wanted me to read too. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with Fran reading some of her poetry, and I'm going to read one of mine that's responsive sort of to one of hers. And then she's going to read a little bit more, and then we're going to pause and we're going to see where we are. But we're going to hear Fran read.
And I hope you guys brought questions, because there are going to be lots of questions. So the first poem I'm going to read to challenge Dora in response is, it's called You Are 2.3 Meters from Your Destination. And it is a retelling of Orpheus and Eurydice. I'm hoping that everybody knows, but thanks to Hadestown and everything else, but it is he should not have turned around is what we should say, but it's Greek myth. I was playing with Greek myth a lot for a number of years, and this is a retelling in about 300 words using only GPS directions. Commencing route for Orpheus of Thrace. Proceed from Ciconian coast meadows southwest to mouth of Eurotas River in Laconia. Approximately 800 kilometers. Travel time to waypoint, 7 days at your current speed. Head 92 kilometers south to Cape Tanaris, also known as Matapan. Find Tanaris Gate. Recalculating. Find Tanaris Gate. Proceed to route. Pass into Tanaris Gate and proceed to River Styx. A toll is required. Exact change is required. Proceed to route. Descend 5,000 kilometers to throne room. Time to destination unknown. Arriving at throne room. Proceed 5.2 meters to throne. Avoid abyss. Make your request. Receiving new information from satellites. Calculating return trip. Exit throne room. Follow northern path to Vale of Avernus, Cicero, Italy. Approximately 6,000 kilometers. Proceed up incline. No turns are permitted on this route. Proceed up incline. You are 500 meters from your destination. No turns are permitted on this route. You are 100 meters from this destination. You are 2.3 meters from your destination. Proceed up. Recalculating. Recalculating. Proceed to route. Proceed to no crossing of River Styx is possible at this time. Proceed to route. Recalculating. Proceed ahead from River Styx, approximately 5,000 kilometers to the mouth of the Acheron River. Calculating new destination. Proceed 600 kilometers northeast through forest to Rhodope Mountains. Time to destination, 5 days to 3 years. Several drinking establishments ahead on left. New route selected. And the way that I wrote that actually was a sort of a collaboration between me and Google Maps, because I actually mapped it. There is an existing map for this poem, but I did it in kilometers. And Joe Walton was kind enough to point out at one point that it should be in Stellus, and I agree, but Google Maps does not work in Stellus, nor does GPS. So I'm sticking to kilometers for that one.
I'm glad you talked about that, Fran, because I really wanted to ask you about that, because you have a note about it at the end of the book about how you calculated. So it's accurate, right? You could actually follow this route.
It's as accurate as I could get it. Of course, the descent was a little bit difficult, but I checked it out with a classicist friend of both of ours, Arkady Martin, and she and Liz Burke both verified that I had done the calculations correctly, and it would survive a board review. So I was pretty pleased with that. So the next one I'm going to read, keeping sort of with the Greek myth elements, is called A Resume. And there are several allusions in here, but I'm going to let them stand for questions later. A resume. And this is the illustration that's on this page, which is the map. It's called A Map as a Resume. Goals include meaningful work using my skill set, preferably by the sea. Experienced in shipwrecks, sea shanties, hospitality. Career highlights. You've heard of Odysseus, a rare near miss. Also, search party experience, though Demeter was not thrilled with the outcome. Close call at a singing competition, but Hera rigged that. Orpheus too. Languages spoken, Greek and Latin. References. Aeschylus at River Gods Inc., several muses, and my equally talented sisters. Willing to relocate. Your turn, Dora.
I will read, but I just got a reference. I'm so proud of myself. And actually, because a student of mine wrote about this, but the search party is that Demeter gets the harpies to search for Persephone, right?
Exactly.
Did I get it?
Yes, exactly. And that's why they got banished, is because they didn't get there in time, and she was mad. Hera being mad, being like every day ending in Y. But at the same time, it's such an interesting little thread that she was like, you go find my daughter. And they were like, meh, couldn't do it.
Okay, so I will read a poem, and this is called Eurydice. And I apologize, I don't have a book to read from because I'm actually in Budapest, you guys. So I am gonna have to read off my screen, but I'm gonna do my.
I'm so glad. I'm so amazed and honored that you stayed awake to do this.
Oh, by the way, yeah, it's past midnight here. So hopefully I will make sense. Okay, so this is from Eurydice's perspective. It's just called Eurydice. If you were in hell for the sin of eating pomegranates or something equally nonsensical, I would go down myself into Hades' stagnant realm, passing Cerberus, tossing him a biscuit, and have a talk with Persephone. Goddess, I would tell her, you understand longing. You have felt it in your chest, that piece of red thread tied around your heart, pulling you upward in spring toward your mother, toward the ground sprouting hyacinths, narcissi, pulling you down again to your dark lord when winter comes. Goddess, give me this man, although he is bound to your service, although he has a face fairer than the ships of the Achaeans and eyes like rain, which you who appreciate beauty in men, collecting the best of them, Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, must admire. Give him to me out of pity, one woman to another. If you deny this request, I will stay here with him, a disturbance, a discrepancy in the land of the dead. When she gave you back to me, I would take your hand and lead you to the land of the living, never once looking back, no matter how much I wanted to see your face. My love would be stronger than my curiosity. I would not look at you until you stood beside me again in sunlight under the blossoming olive trees on Mount Ida.
I love that. I love that. What struck me is that that Persephone and Eurydice are never get to talk to one another in anything.
Do women get to talk to each other in Greek mythology?
That is a very good question.
Like, do Hera and Echo have a conversation, or I don't think so.
I mean, I don't know that anything with Echo could be called an actual conversation, but I think
or Arachne and Athena,
yeah.
do the women ever talk?
I just love the fact that you put them in conversation in her imagination so much. That is so lovely. Do you have another one?
Well, no, you're gonna read Stormtide, right?
Yes, I am, which is more waterborne creatures. And actually this one on the page there's a narwhal on this page. And I'm really happy to see the narwhal. I'll tell the story about the narwhal later. But this is called Stormtide, and this is specifically about the Hurricane Isabel that cruised through my neighborhood in Baltimore of Fells Point in 2004, about 6 months before my daughter was born, 8 months before my daughter was born. David, Nancy, one of you remembers. Stormtide. Most everyone on our street slept through the night that water poured from the storm drains and drowned the cars, a slow apocalypse. Chaos slid wet and dark, so quiet, floated pets on cushions, sinking dining rooms river deep. That night, we walked our streets like strangers, watching drains bubble, knocking doors to wake those we could. We went to bed at 3 a.m., convinced we'd seen the worst out. The hurricane's turn knotted the king tide and drove the river forward, sending the sirens into the hills. In the morning, a canoe passed below our window, a bow-bound Odysseus wrapped in flannel with his six-pack and a GoPro camera broadcasting live. Emergency vans edged the neighborhood, handing out toothbrushes to news crews, oracles who asked us to stand closer to the water's edge for verisimilitude. The other shore had it worse, sirens beating the air, calling at the deep bridges, the wrecked houses, like ships now, facing the steadily rising water alone. Water, like God's, doesn't stop when we ask it. Slowly through cracks, seeping, rising from gutters and drains, back to where it had lived before we paved the city over it. So quiet, so determined, until there's an ocean in our living room, until we are an island and there are birds circling, taking photographs of the new landscape and trading it to the mainland for exposure. We are become scenery. The night after the storm tide lifted doors off the warehouses, rolled over the piers, we woke to light rippling our ceiling, a seagull calling the bones at our window, and sirens singing us outside, drawing us down into the deepening water.
That's absolutely gorgeous. Fran, can we pause for some questions?
Sure.
And then we can get back to reading later, depending on how things go. Because I want to hear about the narwhal. Because you said later, but this is later. This is kind of later.
Okay. Yes. So the narwhal actually has, I think, I'm fascinated with narwhals, especially from mythology, just because they weren't what people wanted them to be, which was unicorns, but they got basically this magical real thing that had this absolutely wondrous thing wasn't enough for us. So it got turned into something else that was mystical and better. And I don't think so. I think they're wonderful in and of themselves, but they've also had over the years been associated with different mystical beasts in the under the water, including sirens and including other elements. And they just fascinate me so much. But that narwhal in particular came out of a little drawing episode I had back in 2018, where I was drawing. I started this at the International Conference of the Fantastic and the Arts, just up in my room after everyone, gave up for the night. I would go up and draw all of the monsters that exist in artists' heads, in writers' heads, and that became a museum of errant critters, which I worked on for a couple of years. And the narwhal was the despair narwhal, because it would just kind of cruise along and go doom, doom every once in a while. And so, and it's been a companion for a long time.
That sounds almost like an Edward Gorey narwhal.
It's kind of a publishing mascot, you know.
So that one thing I wondered about in these poems is the way that you put together the real and the fantastical, because you were talking about the birth of your daughter, but there's also the narwhal, and there's the siren, and so there's this real spectrum from the deeply personal, I think, right? I mean, I'm seeing some things that make me think that they were inspired by your children. There were certainly things that were inspired by real events, but then on the other hand, you've got the Harpies resume. How do you think about all of that? Like, why do you put all of that together? How do you put all of that together? And obviously this is in your prose as well.
That's what poems do, right? They act as a bridge. They find the multiple meanings, and they harness the words that are willing to do the work of 3 or 4 words all at once. And I think with Stormtide especially, yes, it's a hugely personal poem, but it took me a long time to unpack, because I wanted to do it in a way that acknowledged not just my experience, which would be a very personal thing, but also sort of the area experience and what it felt like to be there in that moment for a lot of different people, and to take up more of the space and the moment, and incorporate that. And once you do that, you've got the opportunity to look at both the magic in the world and the monsters in the world, and how that comes into modern experience in a way. And the poem kind of unintentionally started to hinge on the word sirens, because there is that double meaning there, with the sound of the sirens coming and going all over. We heard it all night. And then the call of the sirens drawing us down into the water is an entirely different thing. But that temptation to go and walk through the floodwater, there were a lot of people that just came down and were touristing through this sort of very slow motion disaster that we had. And it was a very odd experience overall. And I wanted to capture that because for me, the personal is something that is really a struggle to put on the page. Sometimes it's really hard to, but if I frame it in a bigger picture way, that feels more like creativity and art and expression, and it feels like a bridge between my experience and the reader's experience reading the poem, and possibly even those of you who were there, and I know some people in the audience absolutely were, that maybe my experience is a bridge to your experience as well. So it's something that when I read people's poetry, I get so many different sort of emotions from what they put on the page and what they choose to share. But it's such a different choosing than the way that we treat social media or we treat Instagram, because everything in those expressions is like we are aspiring to perfection a lot. And I think poetry aspires to connection insteed.
Oh, that is beautiful. I love that.
I made a rhyme.
So
I'm
well.
really proud of myself for.
Yeah, you need to tweet that. Let me ask you about the way the book is structured. Yeah. It's called Clockstar Rose Spine, and those are also the names of sections. So where does that title come from, and how are these sections functioning? Because they do things thematically.
Mm-hmm. They do, but they're all kind of in conversation with each other, which I owe almost entirely to 2 people, Julia Rios, who did sort of a conversational pass-through on this with me, and then my editor at Lanternfish, Christine Newleap, who was just brilliant in the sort of the final pass of, does this really belong here? Are you sure you want this to go there? But also she was the one who turned to me and said, do you want to illustrate this? And do you want to, you haven't seen this yet, but there's also a Q&A in the back about fountain pens. And
I know I was going to ask. No, I have seen it. I've seen it because Feliza sent me the PDF.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
It's amazing. And I have questions about that too.
But the title, Clock Star Rose Spine, comes from a poem that is addressing sort of the cardinal points of a compass rose, which is and has been a talisman for me for as long as I've been on, in conversation with the Chesapeake Bay. I grew up, going to summer camp there. I taught sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. I've lived on the bay. I've had the bay, not knock and come and try and have dinner in my house. But the base for the compass rose and the way that the cardinal points work, there's 4 main sections to it. And those sections then guide our understanding of where we are in relation to other things. And I started thinking about what besides the navigational tool it is, and the rose aspect of it has come down to us through history and through sailing history in particular. It's a star. It's absolutely a star, and that idea of the guiding star and navigation is there. It's a clock. It's a way to tell navigational time, and then also it's a bit of a 3D spine in the sort of, if you think of navigation not as a singular object but as a up and down pole, it's a spindle or a spine too, and that sort of gave me the 4 directions that I wanted the book to go in. But then also each thing, clock, star, rose, and spine, speaks to time, speaks to the universe, speaks to sort of the natural elements, but also roses have, anything that's got that many pages in the Oxford English Dictionary has a major lock on our imaginations and our sense of the mythological. And so that's in there. And then spine also has an aspect that I wanted to talk about in the book, which is disability, and just how, for lots of us, things that are supposed to be straight, the culture imagines as, mandating being straight, are somewhat off kilter in one way or another. And for me, that starts with my spine. So I went there.
That is absolutely
doing
fascinating.
a whole lot of stuff. In this case, well, I said 4 words that are doing a whole lot of stuff. So in this case, if you are an English teacher, this is not a curtains are blue situation. There's a lot in here that you can assign.
The curtains are blue for a reason.
Yes.
That reminds me, it makes me think of 2 things. One is you have this wonderful line in a poem called The Orrery that has to do with, and there's something that comes before this, but we try to shape meanings from symbols.
Yes.
And it seems to me that that's one thing you're doing. It's like a definition of poetry, right? You're shaping meanings from symbols. And the other thing is that there's this double movement in these poems, and one has to do with the self, which is sort of like the spine. It's like the center of the compass rose, and you have a bunch of poems that are self-portraits. Yes. Self-portrait with Frida Kahlo. I wrote a list of them somewhere, and I'm not even sure where my list is, but a bunch of different self-portraits. But then there's so much in here about traveling. And so for me, one of the iconic poems is Self-Portrait as Luggage.
Yes.
Because that has both of them. It's like the self, but then the self also traveling and moving. I don't even know if I have a question about this, but how much of that, what was going on in your mind about with all of these images of traveling? Do you like traveling?
I love traveling. This has been a really difficult period for me because I sort of set my what's happening in my life by where I've been. And the answer lately has been home for so many of us. But I think the self-portraits in particular are that aspect of, where I am in a moment, or where I am in an emotion or a thought. And I put them throughout on good advice, because at one point I had grouped them all together. They're all mostly sonnets, kind of modified. There are a few that actually do the thing, but I was playing with the form as well. and spreading them out allowed for that sort of call and response that I like that we're doing too right now, where we're answering questions and asking each other questions and reading each other poetry as well.
You have one called Self-Portrait While Bearing the Weight of Others that has a line I love. And it's sometimes stretched translucently thin. And I was thinking about that because you just said, you know, it was difficult staying home because of the pandemic, but you were also putting this this book of poetry together during the pandemic. And here it is, you know, published, and it's still the pandemic.
Yes.
How was that experience? I know a lot of people are having difficulty writing during all of this.
I tend to my main trauma response is work. So I do the opposite thing, where I just start working and keep working. And I've been doing a lot of that, but it in reference to like me sort of having my sense of myself in terms of where I'm going, where I've been, travel has been definitely impacted by all of this. And it's definitely been very hard launching both books. I mean, I'm so grateful to all of the indie bookstores who have been supporting me and supporting both Ship of Stolen Words and Clockstar Rosespine, because I mean, doing in-person events really helps things feel real. You get to have face-to-face conversations with people. You get to, you know, hug people, and everybody gets to, you get to see their response in the room to when you're reading, and you get to really, really be there. And honestly, it hasn't felt real. It hasn't felt like this book in particular is going to happen until the conversations that I've been having with my colleagues on these events. This has been amazing. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, I did it. This is a thing. That's kind of cool, but it's been tough. How about for you?
It's been awful. I haven't been able to write anything long. I've only been writing little things. So actually I've been writing poetry, I've been writing articles, some short stories, but just my brain can't wrap itself around long fiction. I think it's amazing that you have 2 books coming out.
Should you come by a poetry collection in your writing? I cannot recommend Lanternfish Press highly enough. They do beautiful, beautiful work. And
speaking of that,
yes,
the illustrations. How are the illustrations in conversation with the poems? Because there was one in particular that I saw, and I absolutely love the poem. It's called My Daughter Takes Up Sewing. But I noticed the illustration at the end is a clothesline, and on that clothesline, right, is hanging a witch's hat and a wand and these little witchy stockings. And I wasn't sure what the little.
It's a bird. That's
is it little, but like a little black bird. It's like a witchy bird.
Yeah. So the answer is yes and no. When Christine commissioned me to do illustrations for my own book, this is the first. I've done, you know, a few illustrations here and there for other people. And when I was Kickstarter Poet in Residence, I did the Museum of Errant Critters just as an experiment. I learned a lot. If you're going to do a Kickstarter, do not forget about shipping. But the illustrations here were my first major commission, and I wanted to figure out a way to organize how to produce all of these, because they were asking for a lot of them, and I wanted to do something really nice. And there are 2 things that were happening. One is that I had been doing drawings for my Patreon for some time, and they have been so supportive, both for poetry and for that. They get to see a lot of things first usually, and they also get note cards when I draw something that I like. I'll turn them into note cards and then eventually send them out. But this group, I went through all the poems, and I wrote down one or two major words that associated with that poem in particular, and it did it really fast so I wouldn't think about it too much. And then I set up my own kind of There is an event in October called Inktober or October Ink, depending on who you're asking. And a lot of artists get together and draw to a prompt for 30 days. And I've done that a number of times, and it's been an incredible, incredible experience. So I decided to do my own kind of Inktober, and the prompts were all of the poetry words that I had written down. So each word has generated something. And then I basically said here and handed them to I handed them to the wonderful people at Lanternfish, and didn't tell them which poem and which image went with what, and let them sort it out. And so some of the things that came back really delighted me and surprised me. And I took a look at it, and there were a couple that I moved around gently. And there was one, the fountain pen compass rose at the beginning of the book. I had initially drawn lines of ink from each of them, and thank goodness for editors. Editors are brilliant. Mine came around and gently, patted me on the shoulder and said, "Fran, that looks like a hypodermic needle. Could you fix that?" And I did. So it just was, it was such a collaboration at that point. And that's, I am so delighted to work with people who are as enthusiastic about what it takes to put a book together, and the conversations that we had about that and images. The fact that they chose this illustration to put on the cover, and it reappears as the last, I think the front page of the last section, in a different way, it just delights me so much, because that was the illustration for Orrery. And so I had so much fun doing this. That's the end of, and I hope people have a lot of fun looking through them and enjoying the different aspects of that.
I love them. Who came up with the idea of the section at the end, which is the Q&A about fountain pens?
That was entirely Christine. So Christine, I am apparently responsible for Christine's fountain pen and ink habit, which I may or may not have turned several people. I'm like the ink vampire, but I may have turned several people on to the fact that fountain pens and inks are really good ways to reward yourself when you have successes or something to celebrate. So we compare inks a lot. We talk about different things, and it was so much fun. When she said, "Would you like to do this?" I said, "That's also something that I've never seen in a poetry book before. So yes, let's do that. Let's break kind of the fourth wall of poetry and talk about the mechanics of how you write and what you write with." And her questions were so good. And I couldn't help myself. I had to do some drawings for it too, which was fun, but it was really a blast. And I get to get technical and talk about which pens I used and which inks went into it. And if you've met a fountain pen person before, they need that information. So I was glad to be able to provide it in the back of the book, because then it's there. And when I forget which inks I use, then I can go and look at the back of the book and figure it out.
It's so much fun.
Yeah.
Here's what I'd like to do. Let's read a couple more poems. I would love it if you would read Self-Portrait as a Selkie, and then I'll read a Medusa poem, and then if you would read Night Watch. And while we're doing that, you guys who are in the audience, I want you to think up questions, and you can put them in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat, and we'll take questions, and I'll read out your questions and get Fran to answer them. So Fran, if you would read, and because I wanted you to read one of the self-portrait poems, and this picks up from what you were just talking about the ocean and storms and sirens, etc.
So Selkies, if those of you who are not familiar with this particular critter, a Selkie is often a woman who has had her sealskin or a version of that stolen, often by a fisherman, and then he takes the resulting woman home to be his wife. And there are lots of escaped wives who go into the sea and turn back into seals in many stories. And one fantastic animated movie, and that is the Secret of Kells, I believe. No, it's the other one, but same movie theater, the same movie production.
Song of the Sea.
The Song of the Sea, yes, it's beautiful. Go watch it. But first, I will read you this poem. Self-portrait as a Selkie. If I could peel my skin from its bones and give it to you, I would, if that would make you love me. Not in the way you say you do, not in the way you said I do, in the way that you would have you look at me in wonder, the way I am, ocean and stars, wind and wildness. See me for me, not by your side, your stalwart, your silent helpmeet, not your pretty bride. If I could peel my skin back and have you still love me then, I would do it over and over again.
Thank you. All right, I agreed that I would read this Medusa poem. This is called Medusa Gets a Haircut. On the one hand, they had been her friends for so long, whispering in her ears, telling her stories, reciting poems, not just the sorts of things you would expect, Sappho and Hesiod, but Auden, Eliot, Yeats. They liked the modernists and Sylvia Plath, Adrienne Rich. They were eclectic in their tastes. Sometimes they had sung to her, only a little out of tune. But Perseus never liked them. He said they were distracting, that she was always listening to them instead of him. Did she like them more than she liked him? They were implying things about him, weren't they? Anyway, although he loved her as she was, of course he did. Otherwise, why would he be with her instead of Andromeda? In a relationship, everyone should be willing to compromise. So she compromised. Anyway, the pixie cut was in fashion. Everyone wanted to look like Audrey Hepburn. She went to a veterinarian. After all, she didn't want to hurt them. Yes, other women go to a hairdresser, but what would you do when you have snakes for hair? He removed them gently under topical anesthesia. She said goodbye to them reluctantly. They were going to some sort of sanctuary for abandoned reptiles. The silence was disconcerting. No more stories, no more poetry, no more whispered conversations as she walked to the grocery store or down to the seashore. Of course, no one looked at her strangely anymore either, although the librarian at her local branch said, I kind of miss them, while checking out her books. Hesiod, Auden, Plath. She had never actually read them. She was surprised to find out how much had been lost of Sappho. The snakes had, of course, known the lost bits. But Perseus seemed happy for a while, and after all, relationships require compromise, don't they? Until the day he told her about Andromeda. There was a sea serpent. He would have to go rescue her because, of course, he would, as though there weren't other heroes just itching for a sea serpent fight. Let's stay friends, he said. She sat in front of her mirror, staring at where the snakes used to be, thinking that she didn't look much like Audrey Hepburn after all, just some girl who once had snakes for hair and no longer did. Then she noticed something small, wriggling. The thing about hair is, as your hairdresser will tell you after you try to cut your own bangs with nail scissors, it grows back.
Yay.
All right, Fran, please read Night Watch, and then we'll start talking about the questions.
Okay. All right. So this last one that I'm going to read is a very Baltimore poem. Back a long time before the waterfront in Baltimore was rebuilt and the walkway was finished, there were a lot of places where the locals would go and walk their dogs and go for walks. And some of them were rickety docks and piers. And there were quite a few abandoned warehouses out on these docks and piers. And one of them has been transformed into an amazing museum, the Frederick Douglass Museum. And this poem is about its former life when it was kind of a husk. My husband, who is known on the internet as the chemist, and I were walking along at night, and we saw sort of someone had a fire going on the inside. So there was something happening there, and we were young and stupid and new to the city and had just started making up sort of a mythology of what could possibly be happening in there without having any clue or knowing very many people. But we imagined ourselves sort of into the action as you do. I sort of feel like all of the trend towards post-apocalyptic fiction was sort of, some people were falling in love with it because they viewed it as survival manuals. We always think of ourselves as the hero in the, if we read enough stuff, then we'll figure out how to survive it. Or if we read enough stuff, then we can be the hero, not just in the act of reading it, but in sort of in that scary moment. And it turns out, spoilers, I'm not a hero in the middle of a scary moment. I'm the one who freezes and goes, "What is that?" Which means that I would be the first clobbered. Night Watch. This also takes a little bit after the painting, the famous painting Night Watch as well, but mostly this is about Baltimore. I do have one thing to say. This has been published before. It was published in Poetry Baltimore in a very different version, and I have edited it. I take poet's license with this, that everything is a draft until you are no longer able to revise. Night Watch. When we first moved to the Rust City, we kept watch for ways to be heroes, found the abandoned, shipwrecked warehouses filled with shadows and monsters. We sought those out, wove stories as charms against danger. We didn't see the slow terrors as we searched for things to fight. You didn't believe in charms, you said, but monsters were okay, so we looked for monsters. In the collapsing dark, we climbed broken brick walls, played a game of what would you do if. We imagined fire and ash, zombies, floods, hid quiet in our thoughts until we were fearful enough that a bag of trash became a body face down, a branch became a hand grabbing from a torn grate. But there was no body, the hand just a shadow in flattened wharf grass, and the two of us practicing heroics, caught in a searchlight, the police helicopter swooping low over pilings and dark water before turning away. The police, looking for a real body, wanted nothing from us, and we disappeared into the shadows. The red sugar factory sign rippled neon on the waves, and wings knifed the air between us and the water. I was afraid. Helicopter light returned, haloed a long, sinuous neck and sharp beak, a heron. Always before, seeing one had meant luck. I pointed it out. But you said herons don't come this far downtown, not with all the factories. But here was one, still as glass, holding the night, its head a blade, its body a charred board, backlit black by the gaining light, fishing the thick water as if we didn't matter. The helicopter returned, beating our ears with its wake as it hovered over the empty lot. The bird turned and stared in the metallic wind, and I felt the boundary of my skull within my skin, the cold of my bones, my eye rims. Our shadows stretched long before us, stalked the water. Then the heron bent to fish again. The helicopter flew away, and I walked on with you, my fingertip pulse pounding, though no monsters had been found. It hadn't meant much to you, a heron where there wasn't supposed to be one. The city kept rebuilding itself. The lot disappeared, the warehouse too. I didn't see herons for a long time. Later, the flood would come and the ash. We talked to news cameras, held fundraisers. We kept going, us in the city, rebuilding, gleaming towers atop burnt piers, sunny days over moonless nights. I remembered at times how a heron watched us holding hands by search-churned water, playing at what ifs while we imagined the night would show us something dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I have some questions for you, Fran.
Okay.
So there are a couple different ones. One has to do with fountain pens. Have you ever matched a fountain pen to a Greek god or goddess or siren versus harpy? And I think we can broaden this question and ask, do you use certain pens to write certain things?
Yes, the answer to the last thing is yes, I do. And it's particular to, I write a group of linked novelettes and novellas called the Gem World series. And for that, I was gifted a Star Ruby pen from a Pelican Star Ruby pen, and I used fire opal ink in it. So which are part of the narrative of the, so it's a bit precious. But I do that quite often. I tend to write in different inks for different days or different characters in my journals, but almost always when I do my plot book, because I have a whole plot book where I work on different plots, and I will stick to the same ink color that I've started with, just so I can find all of the different plot elements again. More often, I think I use specific inks to draw and paint with. I've found just working with blues and yellows and blacks and grays especially has really been something that has gone from habit to obsession. So a lot of my work is in that colorway. And I've never paired a pen with a Greek god or ink with a monster, but now I'm going to.
I can't wait to see. Bethan, who is in London, by the way. Hi, Bethan. You're like one hour different from me. Is asking about your process. And she asks, what advice would you give to a budding SFF short story writer with writer's block? How do I unblock, or how do you unblock? Any tips on sources of inspiration? What is your process, Fran? I mean, how do you write? Are there particular tricks that can help young students? And you're a teacher, so teach us.
For me, I mean, so I published my first short story in 2011, which is 10 years ago. And I have written a lot of short stories since then, as well as longer books. But I was writing short stories for many, many years before that. And I didn't publish them because I never finished them. And since I never finished them, I didn't revise them. And the reason why I never finished them was because I decided they weren't worth finishing. They weren't good enough. And it never struck me until a friend of mine posted a blog post that said, and this is Chuck Wendig, so I'm going to curse because he cursed, but it said, finish your shit. And don't give up on your story. If you start a story, finish it, because then you can go back and revise it. And sometimes writer's block is kind of like that. It's kind of like, well, I'm not doing it right, so I can't do it at all. And when actually you just need to kind of buckle down. Cory Doctorow said once that his writing advice to people is to vigorously apply fingers to keyboard. And I think about that a lot, because sometimes the work of getting a story done, the first draft, is to just show up and finish the story and work on it over a period of days or weeks. And I will tell you, and I think Dora will agree with me, first drafts are allowed to be absolutely terrible. They might not even be full-fledged stories. They're just kind of frameworks. And so, but once you have the shape of it, you can go back and revise it. Writing is an art of layers, and it's an art of seeing and re-seeing over and over again. So that's my first thing. And the second advice that I give everyone is no one is going to run up to you on the street or in your home or anywhere else and say, oh my gosh, I want you to take time to write. No one is going to do that. Even if they do it, they're going to do it for a minute, and then they want you to come find their socks for them or help with the test or whatever. You need to find a way to put writing first. At least, have it be the first minute of thought in the morning, or give yourself, a 15 or 20 minutes, like you do for exercise or anything else, where you're like, this is my space, and I'm going to block that out and I'm going to protect it. And when you start doing that, your brain really does say, oh, okay, now they're prioritizing this, I'm going to give them more ideas, and I'm going to give them more energy to do things. And sometimes you really need to step back and refill that inkwell a lot by reading other people's work. especially just experimenting, seeing what's out there, reading a poem every day sometimes works. Definitely reading the work of people that you've never heard of before. If you look in the back of almost every writer's books, there are acknowledgments to other writers, and you can follow those like breadcrumbs. If you find a writer that you like, go to the back, look at their acknowledgments, and pick out a couple of other writers out of that and see what you can find of theirs.
That fits really well with a question by Serena, which is about what books, music, podcasts, or shows have you enjoyed recently? And I also want to broaden that to ask about your influences, because you're talking about writers, but these are things other than writers, specifically because you have a lot of poems in here about artists. You mentioned Frida Kahlo, Louise Bourgeois. You have a poem, as Heather pointed out, that was inspired by an exhibition, and also a lot about photography. Yes. And Edward Weston, whom I didn't know anything about before this, and he's amazing. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So clearly you're drawing inspiration from things that are not just other writers. And what are those? And what has inspired you recently, but what do you also generally draw inspiration from, Fran?
So I love walking through museums and picking up the images, but also the people having conversations. One of my favorite things to do is go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, because they still allow you to draw in the galleries and just sketch something that people aren't looking at. Because one of the magics of I sketch a lot. I sketch in my journals. I have a couple of sketchbooks that are just dedicated to drawing. And one of the magic things that happens when you sketch something is that it becomes the center of attention. People may have walked past it beforehand, but if somebody's drawing it, it's almost like you put a frame around it saying, this is special. And so I do that a lot, and I just pick up just story ideas and ideas for poems and ideas for drawing series that way. It is a matter of noticing, but also a matter of letting yourself just sort of be like, I'm going to think about that for a little while and put it in my back brain or put it in my journal. My inspirations range pretty far and wide. My poet inspirations have always been kind of the lyrical poets like Rilke and Wisława Szymborska, and some newer poets like Rachel Cruz, who wrote God's Will for Monsters, which is amazing. There are just Neruda and Elizabeth Bishop is kind of a touchstone for me. In part because she's a formalist who writes from exegesis, and she just, that emotion just bursts through the form every time. And I have loved that from the beginning. There are a couple of poets who I studied with who are ongoing inspirations. Rita Dove is one. She has a new book of poetry out. It's called A Playlist for the Apocalypse, and it's phenomenal. The poet Larry Levis.
What a great title.
Yes, yeah, very timely. The poet Larry Levis, who was seeing me through the last semester of my MFA when he passed away, was incredible working with him. Heather McHugh. I think Tracy K. Smith and her poetry, especially Life on Mars, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning book filled with space and emotion. There are just so many inspirations out there, and musicians, Tom Waits, in particular, Rhiannon Giddens, who was one of the members of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, that did a lot of covers of things, but she has gone out and done her own solo albums, and she's phenomenal. I kind of pick things up and go along. My podcasts, I love science podcasts. I love things, I wish I could call them up on my phone, but we've been listening to a lot of science podcasts when we take road trips. And In the meantime, I'm going to plug Charlie Jane Anders and Anna Marie Newitz's Our Opinions Are Correct, because that is a great speculative podcast. But honestly, science and nonfiction is a great place to find inspiration. And I want to make sure we're okay for time. Hannah, do we have a couple more minutes?
Hannah?
Okay. Well, so there's a podcast called Ologies with Allie Ward, and it's stunning. I mean, it gets into the really ridiculous sciences of like snail genitalia and things like that, but it's wonderful. 99% Invisible is one of my favorites. And then I kind of like, I really liked it for a while. Daniel and Jorge Explain the Universe. They are nerds. They are going through sort of science conventions, but also science fictional stuff, and looking at it from different ways. And just the fact of podcasts are sort of a speaking voice filling the space without being, really present, is something that I have loved a lot. I do want to also plug my colleague at Western MFA, J.S. Mayank, did an amazing podcast called America 2.0 in 2018 that is well worth a listen. It is just a really great look at politics and different aspects of that as well. You got more than you bargained for there, but I can get inspired by paint chips and Pantone colors as much as anything else. So, and I love patterns. I love going particularly weird museums, like weird, odd museums. The Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia is a collection of books and ephemera. The Mutter Museum is pretty well known, and some of my stories have definitely taken inspiration from the Mutter. I don't know, Dora, you are in Boston, so you have tons of museums there that I want to come visit, including the Gardner Museum, which is
visit. You have this wonderful line, by the way, Fran: a museum is a book we travel. That was another thing I picked up from one of your poems.
Yes.
I think we're at the end of our time, right?
I think, but Hannah hasn't shut us off yet. So, there's Hannah.
Hi, Hannah. Are we at the end of our time? Should we be wrapping up?
There's one more question if we could answer Serena's.
Which brings us actually all the way back to the beginning, which is, what myth would you most like to write or read in a book about a talk or conversation between goddesses or women? Basically what we were talking about at the beginning, Eurydice and Persephone in conversation, or Echo and Hera, or Athena and Medusa, or Arachne. Which
I don't know. Dora, you want to write a book?
Yeah, we could write a book. We could have a conversation. But which female characters would you like to see in conversation with each other?
I mean, I don't feel like anyone can hold a candle to Madeline Miller's Circe, because that in particular, that book just rocked my world. So I'm going to leave Circe alone, but I think the goddesses, I would be very interested to hear from Hera, because I think she has been portrayed in such a way that I think it would be super interesting. It actually would be getting all of them together in a room would be kind of interesting. But I also like Athena and what was the one with the golden apples?
Eris, goddess of discord.
No, yes, but the princess who did the race. That Atalanta, yes. I would love to hear from those too. I don't know. I think the minute you sit the women of Greek mythology down and put them in conversation, you're probably unpacking a whole bunch of other things as well. And speaking of that, if you haven't seen the Hades and Persephone comic, Lore Olympus, it is worth your time. I'm just going to type it here. It's a graphic novel. It has a book coming out soon, but it is beautifully illustrated kind of teen romance between Persephone and Hades, and all of the other gods and goddesses get into it. It's just a kind of amazing to see. So just a big plug for that as well.
Excellent. Hannah, what do you think? Should we wrap up?
I think that was a wonderful last question, although I'm sad to have to wrap it up for the evening. Thank you both so much. I was completely mesmerized, and I feel lucky that I get to say that to you all. I'm sure other people you can put in the chat too. I'm sure that was the experience for everyone tonight. I'm still stuck on your quote, Fran, that poetry aspires to connection, not perfection. I'm paraphrasing, said it better. But that was the whole essence of tonight. Like, we had fountain pens, and we had women talking to each other in mythology, and we had publishing and design.
We did. We talked to each other. There you go.
You talked to each other. Also, I was thinking, speaking of women talking to each other, I think this anthology is a really wonderful example if you're interested in women writers of the turn of the century. And
actually, and David, you've got to get a copy of this, because there's a Charlotte Mew poem in there. And that was one of the reasons why I asked Dora to read the collection, was because she included a Charlotte Mew poem. And David Bodewin was the first person to introduce me to the work of Charlotte Mew. So
Charlotte Mew is brilliant.
Yes.
Another connection of tonight. Amazing.
I noticed that I'm slowly fading into the shadows here, which is
dramatic.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you all so much for doing this. It was a joy, and thank you to everyone for attending. I hope to see you all at the Ivy Bookshop in person someday. But until then, we had at least someone in London and Budapest and Baltimore and Philadelphia. So we had, it was wonderful. The virtual event has a perk of connecting.
International.
And you guys, thank you for supporting the Ivy. It means the world to us to have independent bookstores with people who are knowledgeable and who remember you from year to year. It's you know, booksellers are so much better than an algorithm. I cannot tell you how much the places like the Ivy matter to us.
Thank you. We feel lucky to do that. So yes, we appreciate you both being here and hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everybody. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Fran. You're so brilliant.
Yay. Good night, everyone.